This is a Tracking the Tropics update with the certified most accurate weather team at First Coast News.
All right, folks, they're going to give me a little extra time to talk and breathe here. And then what we'd really like, because I get tired of hearing my voice talk about this stuff. I find it tremendously interesting. I just get tired of hearing my own voice. So we'd love to have questions from y'all. So what we're showing you here is the 2 p.m. update. Now, if you notice, the winds are right back up to a Category 5. In case you don't know, the definition of a Category 5 by winds are 156 miles per hour. And since we're at 155, that's as close as we get. The number that I think really tells us what a hurricane is doing and potentially can do is the pressure. And that pressure has dropped. It's now down to 923 millibars. So it's as close to a Cat 5 without calling it a Cat 5 as you can get. So what's going on? Well, for a Category 5 to develop, the ingredients have to be perfect. Of course, in a stormy, tragic way, but the ingredients have to be perfect. And it's really an unstable situation, talking about physics here really, for an eye to get as small as they get. We've seen eyes sometimes get as small as 4 miles. There's some debate about maybe a 2-mile wide eye. And I'm talking here the physics of the earth, they just can't get much smaller. And even when they get below about 10 miles, it's really hard for an eye to maintain its integrity. So very often what happens with the Category 5, it develops what we call concentric eye walls. And literally you have 2 eye walls, but what's happening is that smaller eye wall is breaking down, and so there's a larger eye wall. And because now the winds aren't concentrated in one area, that's why then the absolute highest winds are not as strong. But we hesitate to say that's weakened because the overall energy of the hurricane is probably about the same. So anyhow, that's what's going on right now. Concentric eye walls formed overnight, and so we saw the pressure come up a little bit. The winds weren't quite as strong. Of course, any hurricane that's Category 3, 4, 5 is called a major hurricane. And although every category is significant, once you get to major, it really is like the movies. And I mean that in a negative way. Anyhow, it looks like we could have one more concentric eye wall replacement is what we call it. And then starting tomorrow morning, we do think the hurricane will begin to weaken for 3 main reasons. Number one, the farther north it goes, and you can see the forecast track has not changed. It has not changed at all, but the farther north it goes, the more shear. Shear is our friend, it's not the friend to a hurricane. There will be drier air being pulled into the system. Remember, hurricanes, their fuel, warm, humid air. And so once drier air comes in, it's kind of like it's being choked off. And then finally, those waters of the Eastern Gulf, although they're warm, Helene knocked down the temperatures a couple degrees. But here's the forecast. That has not changed. We don't expect even a tweak to this forecast until 5 p.m. from the National Hurricane Center. So what's it all mean for us? Well, for those of you farthest to the south, of course, we expect the worst conditions. Now, I do want to say that if this hurricane goes as officially forecast, we only expect the hurricane force winds to extend about 30, maybe 40 miles north of the eye. And because Putnam and St. Johns County are going to be more than 30 to 40 miles north of the eye, if it goes exactly as forecast, we don't think you're actually going to have technical hurricane conditions. So why the hurricane warnings? Because it's so close, and even this far out, let's say 24 to 36 hours, the average error is about 50 miles. But notice our forecasts haven't changed. And it's not going to change whether it's a tropical storm warning or a hurricane warning, not for those of you in Putnam and Flagler or St. Johns County. So in Putnam and Flagler, we're looking for sustained winds of 60 at peak, gusts to 75. And for all of us, by the way, for all of us, we think the windiest conditions and the highest risk of flooding due to the combination of storm surge and heavy rainfall, think about 10 p.m. Wednesday night through 10 a.m. Thursday morning. St. Johns County, and specifically St. Augustine to Crescent Beach, this is the highest population center, the most amount of people that will have the worst conditions. So again, if it goes exactly as forecast, you may not technically receive hurricane conditions. Technically, a hurricane are sustained winds of 75 or 74 or more, whereas we think you'll have gusts of 75, sustained of 60, but 55 to 60, but that's still a big deal. At those wind speeds, we expect widespread trees coming down and power outages. Now notice the rainfall. We've dropped that a little bit. We're thinking maybe 6 to 10 instead of 12 to 15, and that's because we just have more confidence that the eye wall and the hurricane indeed will stick to the forecast track. There was one computer model up until late last night that we had to respect, even though we weren't necessarily leaning on it. All the models, or the best models, are coming together, and so we're feeling more confident about this forecast. All right, so again, we think the worst overall conditions because of a storm surge of 3 to 5. By the way, for those of you in St. Johns County, and you've been through Matthew and Irma, as bad as this is going to be, Matthew and Irma, for those of you that were impacted by the combination of storm surge and rainfall, that was about 5 to 7, even 8 on the beach as far as a storm surge, whereas this looks to be about 3 to 5. Bad, but not quite as bad as Matthew and Irma. Duval. Notice we've dropped the rainfall, and that's not because the forecast has changed. It's just because now the model that was making us wonder a little bit, it's now come into agreement with that slightly southern or more southern route, which is really, again, we've been sticking with pretty much the I-4 corridor track all along. So therefore, what's that mean? Plan on street flooding in Duval. But the fact that we're not going to quite get to 12-inch rainfall and maybe a storm surge of 3.5 feet, maybe that means not as many homes and businesses will be flooded. I'm talking about the most sensitive areas. That would be at the beaches on the intracoastal side. I'm not concerned about the oceanfront side at the beaches. Intracoastal side, and then in Duval and Clay, as far as the estuaries and the river. And then as we go farther off to the north, still a big deal for those of you in Nassau, Camden, and Glen, but notice all of those numbers come down. And then as we go farther off to the west, really once you get out toward Lake City, those numbers even lower, maybe gusts to 40, maybe 1 inch of rain in Waycross. And I'm saying this for those of you around Lake City and Waycross, and those of you who are maybe wondering why I feel like I'm picking them out in a nice way. They were the ones most impacted by Debbie and Helene, so at least they get to have some nice conditions. One more point, and then I believe Andy has some questions for me I want to make, and that is that even over the waterways of Duval and even the estuary of Nassau County, notice I have higher winds, more like St. John's, and that's because where the waters are warm, there won't be an inversion. An inversion doesn't allow as much wind up high to get down to the surface. That's what's going to happen over land, and that's why on the wider sections of the St. John's and the estuaries and the ocean right next to the beach, those winds will be higher. And I'll leave you with the synoptic scenario, but I'd much rather answer questions if we have some. Andy, we have some questions?
We have some questions. Great. Now, we had this question the other day, but I'd love to get your perspective on it. Have you seen a storm like this that's intensified so rapidly before?
So I do remember, it's rare, no doubt about it. Do I need to repeat the question, or people hear me?
Oh, they can hear me.
Okay. It's rare, no doubt about it. But to have done it this quickly in October, Felix and Wilma. Felix was way out in the Atlantic. Wilma was actually the Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico. Wilma actually ended up going down to 882 millibars. That's significant, well, because it's a record, but also because up until that point, I could say that I had flown into the strongest hurricane ever, which was Gilbert, which had dropped down to 888. So, but on a more serious note, and Wilma was, I'm trying to think of the exact year. It was about 18 to 20 years ago, and that was October. So to put a finer point on that, Andy, not only does it not happen much, but the only 2 times it's happened in the Gulf in October is the last 20 years. And hopefully people who make connections between the warming ocean and that fact will make that connection.
Looks like Hurricane Wilma formed October 15th, 2005.
Okay, so 19 years. Okay. And as a side note, and maybe I'm not sounding serious enough, but I also specifically remember that because then it went right over South Florida, and it damaged one of the arenas where U2 was going to play. And we were concerned about not getting to go, but we did get to go. Okay, enough of the lighter notes. Back to the questions.
You probably answered this. Sorry if it's a repeat, but do you have ETA for landfall?
Okay, so within an hour or two, we think that landfall, and folks, if you're new to hurricane country, when we say landfall, we're not talking about the outer bounds. We're talking about the outer bands. We're talking about the actual eye. And the National Hurricane Center will make a statement when the eye makes landfall. And that's probably going to be about midnight to 1 a.m. So that's Wednesday night into Thursday morning, somewhere very near the mouth of Tampa Bay.
What are the wind speeds going to be in Palm Coast when the hurricane passes through?
So the wind speeds in Palm Coast, those are actually going to be the highest wind speeds in our area. And actually Palm Coast has the highest risk of actually getting pure hurricane conditions. So I think in Palm Coast, you're going to get sustained winds of about 60 to 65, that's sustained. And so that will cause widespread trees coming down and power outages. And I think Palm Coast, you're going to get gusts to about 80 to 85 miles per hour. And probably Palm Coast is where you have the highest risk of as much as a 5-foot surge. If it goes exactly as forecast, the eye wall is going to stay just south of Palm Coast, but it's going to be close.
I love this question from Reagan. She says, please better explain what it means when the pressure number drops.
Okay, so the hurricane hunters are going in there, and it's like they're bringing a barometer to the hurricane. And they literally have what are called drop signs, and they drop these signs. And the sign to me, it also gives us other weather data, but it's like they're dropping a barometer. So think about it this way, that the lower the pressure, the larger amount of the atmosphere around the hurricane is then drawn in toward it. It's kind of like you have a drain in your shower, and it hasn't been draining well enough. And what you decide to do is you're going to make that drain deeper so that more of the water in your shower floor can just go into that deeper hole. And so that's really our way of measuring it. It's saying the hole is getting deeper, and therefore more and more atmosphere is going to rush in toward it. And that's why it can almost become a never-ending cycle, because then the more volume of the atmosphere that rushes into this deeper hole, the more the air at some point has to go somewhere. It can't go into the ocean, and so it's forced up. And whenever you have rising air combined with moisture in the atmosphere, that creates storms. And that's really what a hurricane is. A hurricane's eye wall are continuously forming and then thunderstorms falling apart about every 45 minutes. It's another reason that hurricanes are so hard to forecast. You know, once it gets to be a category 3, 4, 5, it looks like this solid eye wall, but that's actually individual thunderstorms within the eye wall forming and falling apart. And it's all happening because all of that air is rushing into that deepening hole. The air is then forced up, and then these amazingly tragic thunderstorms develop. We call that the eye wall. So hopefully that makes sense.
I think we all just got our meteorology degree there. Have one from Joe. He wants to know if our area will get more rain and wind than we did from Helene.
We're going to get more rain than Helene because, let's face it, really in our area, if you talk about a 24-hour period, some of us barely got an inch of rain from Helene because it was farther off to the west. Because we're going to be north of this hurricane, and because there's going to be a front between us and the hurricane, that helps us with the winds. So I don't think it's going to be very windy, but I don't think the winds here will be quite as strong as Helene, but we're going to get much more in the way of rain. So with Helene, in 24 hours, maybe 1 to 2 inches, we're going to get about 4 times that amount of rain.
You may have already answered this, but what time frame for the worst of the storm for us?
Okay, so for most of us, if you really want to think about when is going to be the highest risk of flooding from rainfall and high tides, and then the highest winds, really think 10 p.m. Wednesday to 10 a.m. Thursday. Now, I do think the heavy rainfall will cut off earlier than that, but if you're really going to think about a 12-hour period, 10 p.m. Wednesday to 10 a.m. Thursday. But the rains will be increasing all day Wednesday, which is why we're really hoping by sunset Wednesday, if not earlier, everyone's off the roads.
And Christy wants to know if you can give a St. Johns River explanation as to what will storm surge and rainfall do to the St. Johns River? How far will it come on land? What will be underwater? She says she hasn't yet seen any descriptions.
Okay, so of course the St. Johns is so large and there's so many different areas, but here's what's critical. Once the surge, and that means the St. Johns River, rises 4 feet above normal, most of that is going to be from the ocean that's coming in. That's a true storm surge. But once you get very heavy rain, some of that additional rise will be from rainfall. But I think most of the surge will be from storm surge, and I'm probably getting in the weeds too much. Bottom line is, if you hear, we're forecasting the St. John's to rise about 2 to 4 feet. If you hear it's getting up to 4 feet, that then does a couple things. Number one, all the drains in the San Marco area, south side estates, up toward Ken Knight Drive and other neighborhoods off of Trout River, even as you get over toward Ortega. A lot of those drains, of course, are draining into the St. John's. Well, if the St. John's is 4 feet higher, that water can't go anywhere. So that means one thing, and we saw this even with non-named storms toward the end part of the summer, is those heavy rains can't drain. And so we just plain get widespread street flooding. The additional problem, though, is once it gets to 4 feet, then the St. John's River is actually coming out of its banks and getting into neighborhoods that I just talked about. So 4 feet is really the critical level. Before we get to 4 feet, because of heavy rains, just think of it as street flooding, which is why we'd like to get off the streets, but just street flooding. If we see that gets up to about a 4-foot surge with heavy rainfall of 4 to 8 inches, then we do start seeing some water get into businesses. Now, obviously that's nothing like the 10 to 15 feet that they're going to have in Tampa, but still then things do start getting critical.
Appreciate your time. If you want to give a last thought, we'll go ahead and close you up here.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So for everyone out there, hopefully you're hearing from us. We're getting more confidence in the overall forecast, but still notice there is a cone, and that's an indication not only from us but from the Hurricane Center that there could still be some variations. Hopefully those variations would be for conditions to be not as bad, but it could be that we go the other way. I think actually what will happen is I don't think we're going to see big changes, but we will be able to tweak individual counties and then neighborhoods within those counties as we get actually closer to the event. So that's what we plan on doing. We'll pass it on to you if there's a major change in the forecast, but I really think from now through Thursday morning, it's going to be us tweaking it for each county and then hopefully getting it down to the neighborhood level as far as what's it really mean in individual locations once we get a little more confidence in the forecast. But I promise you things will be adjusted, so make sure you keep getting those updates.